Have you noticed that some people can shift and grow very quickly, while others seem to struggle to change? The difference between these types of people is one of the key factors that make a huge difference in our life trajectories. If you're a human being living a life on planet Earth, challenge will arise in your lifetime. It will appear differently for different people, but it's something you're going to experience. Some of us can get bogged down in suffering when trying to meet that challenge, and others of us thrive in the face of it. Today, we're going to discuss what determines whether you can rise to the challenge you face or whether you get pulled into suffering. We'll talk about how to move beyond suffering, whether yours or someone else's, and how to use and perceive challenge as a way to accelerate. And after the discussion, we get to the most important part of this episode. The group frequency calibration at the end is where the frequency work happens and where change actually occurs. So be sure to listen to that. Without releasing distortion patterns targeted by the GFC, the change you want will be more difficult to attain because you haven't addressed the root of the issue. I'm Cheong, founder of Spherical Luminosity, and I'm here with my co-host, Tia. Today we're discussing transcending challenge and suffering. So let's jump right in.
So, Karen, obviously we're humans and we're always going to have challenge and struggle. So I don't think we can eliminate it completely, but what's your take on,
Transcending it.
Transcending it.
Yeah, totally. And you're right. So, I mean, we, as humans, are always going to have challenge. And how I'm going to translate challenge is problems, right? You're always going to have a problem. It really doesn't matter what it looks like. And even if we expand and come up higher in our frequency resonance and expand and into more abundance or whatever it is, there's always going to be a problem that you're going to face. The nature of the problem will change, but you'll still face them. And challenge to me is an opportunity to grow. But that perspective is not necessarily held by everybody, right? And so how we face challenge can really dictate how much we expand. Okay, and the thing with challenge is that a lot of us, I mean, when we face challenge, it's not always delightful, right? It's like daunting. You're like, oh, gosh.
I don't want to open this door.
I'm like, oh, this is going to suck. You know what I mean? Or, it just seems like tiring to some people. They feel exhausted by it, or like it's something they can't surmount. Or, and so a lot of people will avoid challenge because they're looking for comfort. And that's a thing that happens a lot in our culture. It's like nobody really wants to put the effort or the work in because it seems, you know what I mean? Like too much effort.
We want to seek for pleasure, avoid the pain.
And really comfort is this really interesting balm that everyone kind of like falls into. It's like just easy to like, be on the couch and binge watch Netflix.
And eat ice cream.
Ice cream or whatever it is that you're doing. Or, and for some people, they have these patterns which cause them to be in suffering, which is another form of challenge. So really, a lot of people will talk about challenge as if it's like a mindset thing. Like a lot of personal development people will be like, okay, well, challenge is something you have to overcome with your will and how you see it. So that's true to some degree. And to me, you can do it that way. It's just a hell of a lot harder, right? You have to like force your will to like surmount the challenge. And there's some people who really get a lot of like pleasure or like ego kind of like pump from having like met the challenge, and they like perpetuate more and more of it, which is kind of interesting, right? It's like, the beating of the chest, like I surmounted that, and then they can tell everybody that they did. Okay. So the thing about challenge is, as you release your distortions, okay, and there's so many distortions around challenge, but as you release your distortions, you start to rise up in your resonance, as you and I have talked about many times, and you start to be able to see things from the big S self, right? The perspective of you as infinite, indestructible consciousness. When you associate from that, the challenge that we have at the human level is, important, right, for the human experience, but also from that the perspective of the infinite, like kind of cute, you know what I mean? Because it's like, it's really, it's in the microcosm of this physical human life, which doesn't mean that challenge can't be hard. I'm not suggesting that, but when you have that perspective, that much broader perspective, you're like, oh, well, in the face of the infinite, this is very manageable, okay? So you start to have that perspective, which makes it easier. And then, like I said, once you start to release the distortion patterns, which is the thing that causes us to bind up with challenge, right? Like we
Okay.
don't, like we can see it with fear or anxiety or worry and all these lineage patterns. As you start to release your distortion patterns, you start to trust yourself, right? Because now you can surmount them. You know what I mean? You have less heaviness that bogs you down as you try to rise against it.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Right.
You're just able to rise up better because you're not as like heavy with all the stuff that you've been, have running through you.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. This is great. So perspective is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That makes sense. Like I'm thinking about like, maybe this is a little side topic, but when someone wants to change how they feel and they put like positive affirmations and that's what you're saying about, yeah, there's a mental level, but you're not really rising above when you just stay in that smaller mental human experience level.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the challenge, what can happen is if you don't release distortion patterns, the same kind of challenge appears at the same level. Right? So for example, right? So if you have challenges with scarcity, let's just say, right? And this is actually something that's happening in your life a little bit. It's like when you have challenges with scarcity, the challenge can be to clean up all your financial stuff, right? And you can think, okay, well, this is like a mindset thing. I'm just going to do it from that perspective.
Right.
But if you don't release the distortion patterns that have to do with the scarcity, the fear, the control, the lineage patterns, all that stuff, you still perpetuate those same scarcity patterns. Make sense?
Yeah.
But if you release the distortions, the challenge you encounter with scarcity will be different. So instead of like, all right, well, I'm having a challenge paying my bills. That's the level of scarcity we're at right now. Okay. What can happen is like, okay, I now have released enough distortion patterns. I don't have problems paying my bills actually, but now I want to buy a house. So that's a different level, right? So, okay, so you deal with those distortion patterns. Okay, now you've bought the house. So, but you see what I'm saying? The experience is rising up in resonance.
Right.
So now you've bought the house. Okay, well, now it's really about, we can afford the house and that's fine, but we're thinking about buying a second home. How do we get that to do? Or how do we expand our business? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes.
The level of the challenge that you meet will be of a higher level order because
you can meet it because
you've risen in your frequency resonance.
Right.
So the challenge that you're presenting with will still exist. It's not like you never have a challenge. That's how you grow, but it's of a higher quality, right? I mean, buying a second home is a pretty nice high quality problem compared to like not being able to pay bills. Yeah.
And also probably the mundane like day-to-day challenge, like you're driving along and you have a flat tire, like those basic ones, I would think you have less attachment to.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about that big S self.
Yes.
So these little things, traffic and all the like human things, it just kind of becomes a little, the emotion maybe tied to it, there's more space.
Yeah,
between
exactly.
you and that.
There's more space. And if you have the emotion, the other thing that's wonderful about the big S self and releasing more distortion is your emotions aren't as fostered by the mind. So meaning you have the emotions. So you're in traffic and you're like, oh, for God's sake, I'm late. And now this is going to cascade into, right? So you have the emotions like, the frustration of like the time.
Yeah, because you're human.
Because you're human. And then, but what happens is, when you get home that night, 8 hours later, you're not still like bound up about the fact that you were in traffic. And angry about it and frustrated. You kind of forgotten about it, right? Because like you've moved on. Like you've had the frustration, you did it, and you kind of like, okay, had the emotion, you allowed it to happen.
Yeah.
And then because your resonance is high enough, it didn't really impact you. Does that make sense? You had the emotion of it.
Okay.
And that's fine.
And this is the point of the transcending that you're talking about.
Exactly.
So here's the problems. They're always going to happen. If you're a human being in the world, they will be there.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you don't hang on to that emotion and then like create more of that kind of emotional state.
Okay.
You're just kind of like, okay, well, that happened, that kind of sucked, whatever. And you kind of like almost vaguely remember, you're like, oh, that's right. There's that thing that happened yesterday or today that I don't really even remember anymore. But that's what my point is. Like, so the quality of what you face or deal with in terms of your challenge changes. And those little things that can really bind us up kind of pass through us.
Pass through us.
Yeah, as opposed to getting stuck on them.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
I bet too, things like from your past, like even if you're doing frequency work starting now, and you can think back to things in your past that maybe you've held with you, and you can transcend those and grow from them.
Yeah, totally, because they don't have the same, well, it's funny. People have different experiences when they do more and more frequency work. So some people, they'll look at their past and they'll kind of like see the gift in it. You know what I mean? It's like, that's what brought me here. So they have gratitude for it, which is really awesome. Some people, and I'm one of those people, they have trouble remembering because it's like it's not there. that past is not there. Like you've shifted your timeline so that you're in a dominant, higher resonating timeline. You don't, it's really weird. It's like literally people will say to me, okay, well, what happened to you at this age? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. And then I have to think about it, and then I have to yell to Chris, what was I doing when I was 21 or whatever? Like, I don't remember.
Yeah.
And it sounds weird. It's not like I'm trying to block it out. It's like, and then the way I access it, it's going to sound really weird. I have to scan myself. I'm like, okay, that's what, at the time, I'm like, okay, I scan myself. This is the tone of it. Oh, that's right. I was doing this. Does that make sense? It's so weird. It's backwards. It's totally backwards, but that's how I do it. So, yeah.
That's funny.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, so different people respond differently.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so when challenge occurs, do you have any little, like, I mean, not everyone can, like, put on a GFC at the moment, or so for someone who's new, right, who hasn't been doing the work constantly, is there any, like, I don't know, tip in the moment? Breathe, just let it pass through?
So that's a really good question. So, all right, I'm going to talk about suffering in a minute. Okay. So for those of you who tend to have a lot of suffering, I'm going to address this a little bit differently. Noted. But if you're kind of newer and you don't have a tendency towards victim and suffering, then my answer would be this. Okay. So this is going to sound totally like, why would I be doing this? And haven't you repeated this before? And my answer is yes, to become aware of your body. Okay. Because what happens when we're in challenge, right? We go right into our heads. We're like, oh, crap, right? Something's happening now. Oh my God, all these possible
and then you
things.
Create stories.
Yeah, and then it's like, oh my God, this could happen in the future and all these different things. And what if they meant this? And this could happen. And like, okay, where are you? You're like, projecting into a future that doesn't even exist. You're not present in your body. So, and when you're doing that, you're kind of like spinning in the anxiety of a future that doesn't exist. Okay? If you bring yourself back into awareness of your body, and I know it sounds like, why would that even help me? It helps you because when you center yourself back into your body, okay, first of all, you're not creating all this sort of tailspin in your head, which makes it worse, right? It just drops your frequency resonance because you're like, it's stressful, right? And you're feeling anxious and like, what could happen? And now you're not even, like I said, present. Just drops your frequency resonance. So when you come back into your body and you breathe, what can happen is that you're like, okay, all right, I'm aware of the space between my toes. Okay. Or I'm going to hold my breath until it's uncomfortable. Not painful. Okay. I didn't say like
don't pass out.
I didn't say don't.
While you're driving.
Don't do that. Obviously not. But just until it's uncomfortable. So you can like bring yourself in. You're like, okay, what matters? Like, is any of this happening right? You know what I mean? Like, we tend to project all this stuff. It's like, okay, like right now, how am I right now? And then being able to, once you come back into your body, if you're in traffic, you can probably look at the sky because you're probably outside since you're driving, for example. Right? Okay. All right, so there's the sky. I can start to feel expansive. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can kind of bring yourself into the present moment. And when you're present in the present moment and centered in your body, now you can create something different other than that tailspin that you were creating before.
Very good. That's really, really great. It probably takes discipline to be able to do that.
It does.
But I know it can be done.
Totally.
Just a quick little side story and we'll get to suffering. I used to work at a rehab for young teens for drugs and alcohol. And one of the tips we learned as mentors when someone's going through and like spinning out into their crazy thing, actually a bucket of ice water and put their hands in it. Yeah, and I'm just remembering this one person where like she was going off. Like I thought she was going to jump out the window. I think she was going to jump out the window. And so we got her to put her hands in the ice water and she just slows down and then starts laughing. And it was totally fine. And I was like, what?
Physical discomfort. Isn't that interesting? So it just brought her right back into her body. Because she was spinning out into like a different realm or wherever she was going. Right. So that's a great trick. Right. And that's why I'm saying that the physical discomfort of the breath, because you may not have ice with you, for example.
No. Sure. Probably not. Or go get it
and put it together.
Prepare it.
But that's I love that. That's a really fantastic methodology. So, but they're using the same concept, right?
Become present. Whatever way you can become present.
Because when you come fully present, then you're in, you are now in a position to co-create your reality better, to influence it better. You cannot if you're up in your head. You just can't. And so the other thing I wanted to mention about suffering. So suffering is something that people ask me about a lot. It's like, why do I get into suffering when you are in suffering or people around you are in suffering, which is a form of challenge, by the way, it can really dominate your world because all you start to think is, all I see is suffering, more suffering. More. It's like that is my existence, is suffering.
Okay, so real quick, what's the difference between challenge and suffering to you?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So to me, the difference between challenge and suffering is that challenge tends to be something that's external to you, that happens to you, that you have to rise up against. Suffering is more of like an internal state. And for a lot of people, that internal state is something that becomes, this is when it gets a little bit dangerous, when it becomes their identity. Okay, so if your identity is like, I suffer, then now we have a bit of a challenge because now you've like internalized it into your level of identity, which then is a really like a much heavier distortion than other distortion, right? Because it's like the I am statement, like I am
anything
someone
that
who
affects
suffers.
your identity, that's tough to pull
away from.
Yeah.
So I think with suffering, there is this feeling of, or because of the distortion of it, like this feeling of despair, like I can't get out of it, it's never going to end, that type of thing. With challenge, there is the difference in resonance is that when you're in suffering, the resonance is low because you are very disempowered, right? And your filter is almost always the perspective of the small s self, right? Like I'm here, I'm stuck, it's very human, it's very limited, it's smaller. Right? Because you're in suffering. Whether I can't see beyond that experience. Yeah. When you have challenge, and okay, so the difference is in resonance, right? So if you perceive suffering, your tendency will be to be lower in your frequency resonance. If you perceive it as challenge, it's a shift up in your frequency resonance. Okay, because you're like, oh, this is external to me. I can surmount this because it's not you.
It's not penetrated into my brilliance.
Exactly. Right? With suffering, especially if it's your identity, that is you. There's no, you know what I mean? You can't get out of it. With challenge, you're like, okay, well, this sucks. It's kind of coming at me, but it's outside of me. So I can rise up against it, you know? So it's different. So I think the difference really is in frequency resonance. And like I said, with small as self, when you're mired in it, in suffering, it's really, really difficult to come out of it. That's why, and then all these distortion patterns will like reinforce it, like victim or martyr or low self-worth or whatever it is, right, for the disempowerment. All that can be packed in there. And honestly, without the work of frequency work, it's really hard. Right, because like you said, like we talked about, right? It's part of your identity. You're like, it's just intrinsically running there.
Yeah, I think we all know people that are like, you know, you say, oh, hi, how are you? Oh, I have muscular dystrophy, whatever the thing is. And it's like, no, I asked like how you are. Or what your name is, you know, and they just, that is so their identity. Yeah, and that whole victim pattern.
Exactly.
It's very downer.
Yeah, it's low in resonance.
Yeah.
So I just want to distinguish physical pain from suffering. Okay, because a lot of people will associate physical pain with suffering because pain is terrible. I mean, it hurts, right? It's kind of hard to like get around it, kind of. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you must suffer. And the reason I say that is because like my father had a tremendous amount of physical pain because he had his lower discs in his spine had like popped out, like they were popped out of his spine, basically. And there's a lot of inflammation. He had a lot of pain, etc. So in the 80s, or like mid 80s or something like this, they decided that he was a candidate for this sort of experimental surgery where they're going to fuse his spine vertebrae together, and that would stop them from popping out, and therefore he would have less pain. That was the theory. And it was supposed to be very low risk, and it didn't work for like 1% of the population. Like, right? Okay. Exactly.
I know where we're going.
I know that's where we're going. We're heading down this train track. So my father, who'd been in tremendous pain, even though he was very active and in his, I think, 30s at the time, and then when his back started to go out, and then he became into his 40s, and then it was so bad that he couldn't like sit, stand, whatever. It was just terrible. He decided to elect for the surgery because he was just like, it's hard for me to function in my life. So he had the surgery, and he ended up being in the 1%. Okay, where it was just like he got worse instead of better. It sucked. So his whole experience of his life was framed through the lens of how can I move past this physical pain. because it dominated the lens of his life, right? It's painful all the time. There's nothing you can do about it. So, and it oddly, it opened him to seek outside of the traditional Western paradigm, because he was just like, there's got to be another way. This isn't working. Like, I've tried the drugs, I've tried whatever they told me, and it doesn't work. So that's when he started to open up to meditation. That's when he started opening up to things like yoga, like the things like, you know, his diet started to change. It was just interesting, right? Because he was seeking. He was like, how is it possible for me to transcend this? So do you see it? So for him, it wasn't about suffering. It's like a challenge to transcend. He's like, how do I transcend this? And I'm not saying he was like a glorious person and like an angel the whole time. Like my dad was kind of crunchy in many ways. He had a hot temper. But he saw it as this challenge. And so what was amazing was he, in his life, especially when he moved to California, he was probably in his 70s at the time. California was like a smorgasbord for him. He was like, whoa, look at all these modalities.
Totally,
like, they're
right?
kind of out there. All out there.
Yeah.
Exactly. And people are experimenting with them who aren't crazy, you know?
Yeah.
And he started open to all these different things. And really, that's what... you know, he became brighter and brighter as he got older, even though he was physically like worse and worse, like in terms of his physicalness. But he didn't suffer. Does that make sense? I'm not saying he didn't experience physical pain, because he did.
Yes.
Quite a lot of it. But for him, what that opened for him was an expansion of his spirit. Now, I'm not saying in any way that you have to suffer in order to expand your like your experience on the spirit level or to raise your frequency resonance. It is not required, okay? So let me just put that really clearly, because there's a lot of religious and weird like spiritual stuff which says you must suffer. It's more noble and therefore you will ascend more if you suffer. I'm like, no, that's not required. And for my dad, it drove his seeking. You know what I mean? His trying to resolve that for himself gave him the fuel to start to seek, which is the thing that ultimately caused his awakening before he died.
Perfect.
And so I just want to distinguish those two things, because they're not necessarily intertwined.
Thank you. Yeah.
And also, you know, it's funny. In this consciousness, suffering and sacrifice are intertwined with the heavier, denser distortions. You know, it's kind of like, you know how we've talked about before, like there's oppression, greed, scarcity, like abuse, all that like heavy, nasty stuff.
That's not the new consciousness coming. That's the old
one.
Yeah.
Suffering is like right in there. Okay, with those things, okay? Those heavy distortion patterns that we're moving away from. Like, have you noticed that a lot of people, like, love is intertwined with suffering? You know, it's like, in order for me to love you, I have to suffer. You know, like, you know what I mean?
Romeo and Juliet-ish kind of like,
yeah, exactly. But it's strange. Or like, in order for me to succeed, I must suffer. In order for me, you know, whatever. It's all
I know a
kind of
few people like that. Like, you got to work hard every day, no breaks.
Yeah.
You make your money and no time for vacation. You got to struggle.
Yeah.
It's like, no thanks.
Yeah. But that is really in this current consciousness. And that's what we're rising above in the new consciousness, where we can see things more as challenge and then take that as an opportunity to learn and grow. Now, sometimes when you face challenge at whatever level you're like, all right, okay. Like, here we go. You know? You have to rally yourself. It's not necessarily a cakewalk.
Yeah.
You're not like, oh, challenge, it's going to be amazing.
No, no one really is. It helps when maybe you're with someone else who's challenged and you can do it together. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. But it's not like, it's, you know what I mean? As humans, it's, you know, challenge can be something you have to like rally yourself for, but in that rallying, that's the strengthening. You know? So anyway, I just feel that as we move from this old consciousness paradigm into the newer, higher resonating consciousness paradigm, we are starting to drop away from suffering and moving more into challenge, but as an opportunity to grow. Because we're not as dense with all those distortion patterns.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is the main thing is clearing yourself up on frequency level, of course. That's the topic usually.
Yeah.
And then also your perspective.
Yeah.
So like moving into the big S self so that you can move out of suffering to see the bigger picture that is challenged to overcome. Right?
Totally. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. And for those of you who are watching, don't forget to check out the GFC, because that will start to help you to release those distortion patterns that we're talking about. We're about to start the Group Frequency Calibration, or GFC,
where we actually do the frequency work and where change is catalyzed. To get to the GFC, click on the square that'll appear to the right or the link in the description below. It's time to bring in a new experience, a new consciousness, and a new world. Let's rise together.